David Lammy.
To ask the Secretary of State as she leaves the chamber if she will make a statement on the suppression of the Windrush Learned Review and its implications for the deportation flight that's set to leave the country on Wednesday.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Righting the wrongs suffered by the Windrush generation has been an absolute priority for this government. People who had arrived in this country as little more than infants, who had built lives and raised families here, were told that they were no longer welcome. This should never have happened. It was a terrible mistake by successive governments and by the Home Office. Since these injustices came to light, the government has moved swiftly to give those affected the certainty they need. This is why we set up a task force to help people confirm their status. I confirm over 8,000 people have been granted some form of documentation, including over 5,000 grants of citizenship under the scheme. We have also launched a compensation scheme to address the financial hardship suffered by those left unable to work or access other support systems. And to ensure nothing like this ever happens again, the former Home Secretary commissioned an independent lessons learned review. In recent days, news coverage has referenced extracts of a draft report that were leaked in June last year in the context of a planned deportation charter flight to Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to comment on leaks, but let me be very clear. The Lesson Learned report has not been suppressed. The report is yet to be submitted to ministers by the independent adviser, Wendy Williams. It will be for the Home Secretary to publish her report once it has been received. It is vitally important we allow Wendy Williams the time and space to produce her report without political interference. When it is available, the Home Office is committed to publishing it as soon as practically possible and will take its findings and any recommendations very seriously. With regard to tomorrow's charter flight, the Home Secretary is required by law to issue a deportation order for anyone who is a serious or persistent foreign national offender. It does not matter what part of the world they are from, whether it is the United States, Jamaica, Australia or Canada. It's criminality, not nationality, which counts. It is a legal requirement as set out in the UK Borders Act 2007, introduced under a Labour government. And just to remind the Right Honourable Member for Tottenham, he was a member of that government and did not, as far as I can recall, raise objections at the time to its provisions. Mr. Speaker, we cannot breach the Act, and we will not allow foreign nationals who are convicted of the most serious offences, including rape and child sexual abuse, to remain in Britain. Tomorrow's flight is about keeping the public safe. It cannot and should not be conflated with the wrongs suffered by the Windrush generation.
David Lammy.
Mr. Speaker, I regret the tone with which the Minister's just responded to this urgent debate. It was 2 years since there was consensus in this House at the way that the Windrush generation had been treated in this country. This is a generation of people, thousands of them, who came to this country after the Second World War and gave so much but took so little. Let me just remind the Minister, 164 people were detained and deported, which the government says it got wrong. On the back of that, 5,000 people were denied access to public services, healthcare, pensions, education, all that they were entitled to. Against that backdrop, he's right to say the government rightly set up the Independent Learn Review led by Wendy Williams. In the wake of that, they suspended flights to Jamaica. So the question today is, why have they resumed those flights? In light of the scandal of people who arrived in this country as children, how can he guarantee the House that there are not people on those flights who are actually British nationals? And in the wake of the leak, where Wendy Williams herself says that you should not be deporting people under the age of 13, can he confirm that there are people on that flight who arrived in this country aged 2, aged 3, aged 5, aged 11. And when he relies and says to the House that all of them are, or gives the impression that they are murderers and rapists, he knows that there are many who are there for non-violent offences. We cannot, at the same time in this House, condemn county lines and those who would pimp young black children in this country and send those same children back to Jamaica for such drug offences. So I say to him, when will we see this Lessons Learned review? It was promised in March last year. It was then delayed till September. We are almost now 2 years on, and people watching see the way that this government holds in such disrespect the contribution of West Indian, Caribbean and black people in this country. When will Black Lives Matter once again?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let's be clear. Let's start with the review. When will it come? Ultimately, this is an independent review, and the timing is in the hands of the reviewer. Ministers cannot compel it to be produced by a particular date. And let's be clear, the status I've checked, there are no British nationals on that flight. And let's be clear, the foreign national offenders on the flight have been sentenced to a total of 300 years in prison. The offences are, as we said, relate to everything from sex offending, serious drug trafficking offences, violent offences, firearms offences. That is what is happening in this incident, and based on, apart from 2, legislation passed under a Labour government in 2007. And I think to define the Windrush generation by this particular group of offenders is truly wrong. The Windrush generation should be defined by the midwife who delivered hundreds of babies, the person who travelled thousands of miles, worked hard and provided for their family for decades. And I do think it is absolutely remarkable now, the lines being adopted opposite, that somehow it's defined by those who are either serious or persistent criminal offenders being deported from this country. I have to say, many listening to the exchanges this afternoon will think the Labour Party not only lost an election, they've lost the plot as well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that it is important that the views and the feelings of victims of crime are taken into account in our criminal justice system and how it operates?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I do agree with my honourable friend, and many will have expected that, given the provisions of the law that have been in place for the last 13 years, that when someone was convicted of this type of offence that many of those on this flight have committed, that deportation may well be considered. And let's be clear, drugs is not a victimless crime. We only have to look at the death rates, particularly the tragic figures we had last year in Scotland, to see the impact of this. So, as I say, the law is there, the law is clear, and it's not a might, a may or a could. It was legislated in 2007 that it was a must issue a deportation order.
Shadow Home Secretary Diana.
The public will note the very dismissive attitude the Minister has taken to my colleague, the member for Tottenham's very serious, urgent question. One of the problems with this deportation flight is it's not clear how many people on it came to this country as children. The Minister said he won't comment on leaks from the Windrush Lessons Learnt review. Will he accept that the Stephen Shaw review of detention suggests we should not be deporting people who came here as children? Is the Minister aware that some of the proposed deportees have effectively been held incommunicado because of problems with the mobile signal in their detention centre? And is the Minister aware that one thing the Windrush scandal teaches us is we need to be absolutely certain when we are deporting people in this way, that we are clear about their immigration status. Clearly, none of them are of the Windrush cohort, but some of them may be the children and grandchildren of the Windrush cohort, which would have made it difficult for them to establish their nationality. And is the Minister aware of the very real concern in the community about this mass deportation flight? And his dismissive attitude suggests a dismissive attitude altogether to the concerns of the community and what is problematic about this mass deportation flight.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would agree with the Shadow Home Secretary that it's right extensive checks are made before people are listed for deportation on a flight such as this. And let's be clear, these are offenders who've been through the courts, have been sentenced. There will have been opportunities to put up representations against their removal. There are, as you'll know, exemptions in the 2007 Act, which apply around, for example, the Refugee Convention or the European Convention on Human Rights. And those matters have been considered, and many have lodged appeals during the time as well. But I would be clear again that the public would look in on this debate and would say that these are persistent or serious criminal offenders. The law is very clear, and it is a statutory must on the Home Secretary to make a deportation order. And as I say, the law is applied based on the criminality, not the nationality of the offender. And there are regular deportations to many other countries across the world. So we will consider the review, but we'll also be clear that victims and the public have a right to be protected as well from serious criminals.
The House, I'm aiming to run it for around 45 minutes. Steve Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Surely voters for all parties right across the country would expect serious and persistent offenders to be deported in accordance with the law. But could I ask my honourable friend to just tell the House what is the minimum threshold at which somebody becomes serious and persistent, so that we can understand what criteria are that are being applied to put people on these flights?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Normally the definition of a serious offence would be one that has attracted 12 months in prison. I would say, actually, in terms of persistent, that can be looking at the nature of the offences. So it wouldn't be, for example, a particular number you have to hit, but the nature of your offending patterns. But again, as he says, the public would have an expectation that serious or persistent offenders who are liable under this Act to be deported would actually be removed from this country unless the exceptions apply.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree that it's hugely troubling that the Lessons Learned review has not yet been published, but it's totally unacceptable that this charter flight could proceed before all the lessons of Windrush are learned.
Hear, hear. Windrush
should change everything. Instead, the Home Office carries on as if nothing has changed.
Yep.
Will the Minister admit that this flight will include people who were entitled to British nationality but couldn't access it because of complicated and expensive nationality procedures, including, for example, one individual who was in the care system? When will access to British citizenship finally be made affordable and simple? Doesn't he accept that many on this flight have a far stronger connection with Britain than Jamaica? As Stephen Shaw would put it, in reality, many are more British than they are Jamaican. For example, will the Minister confirm that on this flight, this flight will leave 41 British children separated from their fathers and 9 British citizens without partners or husbands? Is it not time to look at this legislation again? Finally, written answers confirm that the Home Office has taken absolutely no interest in what happened to the people on its last charter flight to Jamaica. Isn't that the height of irresponsibility?
Hear, hear. Right.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, we'll be clear that we have checked that there is no one on the flight who would be eligible to British citizenship or nationality. That would, again, we would not be able to be deported if they were. And these cases have been through the courts. And again, I would make very clear, the law is very clear, the offences committed are very clear, and the way the Home Office applies these rules, we are very clear. It's based on the criminality, not the nationality of the offender.
So the Bradman.
shrill virtue signalling and faux outrage simply ignore the political and legal realities of this issue. My parents emigrated to the UK in the 1960s from Commonwealth countries, and they could have been caught up in the Windrush issue. Thankfully, they weren't. But this is an issue for which the government has apologised and for which it is taking remedial action. Can the Minister confirm? British citizenship is a privilege, not a right, and those foreign national offenders who abuse their time here need to face the full force of the law.
Minister.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. To be clear, anyone with British citizenship would not be liable for deportation. But my honourable friend is absolutely right, and we should not define the Windrush generation by a group of people who have committed serious or been persistent criminal offenders. The Windrush generation is the midwife who delivered hundreds of babies, the person who worked hard to provide for their family. That's who defines that generation, not serious offenders.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I must say that the Minister's tone and his response to this debate has been quite shameful. My constituent came here from Jamaica when he was 5 years old. All of his family also live here. But he is set to be deported on this flight tomorrow, having served a 7-month custodial sentence in 2015. Now, given the leaked lessons learned review issues, is it not right for the Minister and for the Home Secretary and for the government to actually take stock, hold this flight, just to make sure you do not inflict any further harm, because you've made this mistake was made previously when people were deported and they ended up dead?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, we do want to make sure we prevent further harm, and that's preventing further harm to future victims of crime that may be committed by the persistent or serious offenders who are on this flight. And as we say, the law is very clear, and it is rather strange to have these type of attacks on a Conservative minister for actually defending and outlining what was actually a piece of legislation pushed by the Labour Party.
Sir Desmond Swain.
What's the most trivial offence of those that have been put on the flight that's been committed?
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It wouldn't be right for me to get into the details of which offences individuals have committed, yet those on board include those who have been convicted of rape, rape of children, those who have firearms offences, serious drug offences. But as I say, the legislation is clear about what the exceptions are, and again, those will have been assessed before the final deportation notices are issued.
There's a Cuba.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants says that it has become aware that potential victims of trafficking have also been served with removal directions. Will the Minister please confirm with a clear yes or no whether or not there will be victims of human trafficking on this flight?
Minister.
Any claims made for the protection routes will have been assessed. But what I would say is, again, we are talking about a plane of people who have been sentenced to a total of 300 years in prison, 300 years, committed serious offences, and are based on the exceptions that are under the 2007 Border Act. And that is the law we will comply with.
Vicky Board.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A number of my Chelmsford constituents have written to me about this case, and I'm sure my right honourable friend is aware of the court case that was heard in Chelmsford last year regarding protesters at a previous flight. With that in mind, and given that we do have a legal duty to deport persistent and serious offenders, can my right honourable friend assure me that he personally has looked at each individual case and that every case involves a persistent or serious offender?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To be clear, yes, I have been through the manifest, but it wouldn't be appropriate to discuss individual cases on the floor of the House of Commons. But let's be clear, all these will have been assessed based on professional assessments, based on the law, and based on whether they fall around the exceptions, including things like right to a family life under the ECHR.
I'm Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Never again. The benches opposite told us when they were dragged to this place over the first Windrush scandal. Now we're hearing lessons learned in that report, again on deaf ears, because ultimately we all know on this side of the House that this Windrush is state-sanctioned racism, and it's given permission to racists across this country to attack people day in, day out. When will the Minister understand that this flight must be stopped, or on his head be it?
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I do listen to some of the comments opposite. On our head, if we stop the flight, we'd be not complying with our legal duties. We'd be potentially seeing persistent and serious offenders remaining in this country when they were meant to be being deported under an act passed by a Labour government. I must say, many people listening to this will agree with this government that it's the criminality, not the nationality, that should be determining what happens in this case.
Steve Double.
Mr. Speaker, would the Minister agree with me that the legal duty on the government to do the right thing to keep the public safe by removing serious criminals from this country is completely separate from our duty to do the right thing by the Windrush generation who helped rebuild this country after the war?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I couldn't put it better myself. The Windrush generation has made a huge contribution to this country, and it's absolutely unbelievable that some opposite want to define them by a group of foreign national offenders who have been sentenced to a total of 300 years in prison. It's truly remarkable.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A number of those facing deportation tomorrow were found guilty of drug-related offences and have indeed served their time. Meanwhile, we have a Prime Minister who has said that he has taken cocaine, which is a Class A drug. Is it one rule for some and indeed another rule for others?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, it's a law that looks at the criminality, not the nationality of the offender, and it's safe to say that possession would not meet the threshold for deportation set in 2007, supported by some members opposite.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Can my honourable friend confirm that these people on this flight tomorrow are not only serious or persistent offenders, but also all adults, and that they were also all convicted whilst adults and not as young offenders?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the exemptions under the Act is around not having to make a deportation, or is where the offender is convicted under the age of 18. But there is no one under the age of 18 on the flight tomorrow.
Yvette Cooper.
Could the Minister provide some facts to the House, particularly the individual sentences and the offences of those who were on the flight, and also what age at which they came to this country, and also could he tell us whether any of them have been affected by the issue about lack of mobile phone coverage that the Home Office has recognised was an issue?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In terms of the offences on board, as I say, they all meet the thresholds for deportation set under the 2007 Act by the government that she was, of course, a part of. In terms of their cases have been considered by the courts around, including whether ECHR rights that apply. And again, we are clear that this is people who have committed serious or been persistent offenders who are qualified under the legal duty the Home Secretary is on. One, that this is within the law, and therefore, as we say, it's about criminality, not nationality.
Tomlinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And isn't that the point? Isn't there a difference between foreign nationals who come to this country, who make a contribution and who are law-abiding, and those who are serious or persistent offenders? Can my honourable friend confirm that offences of those on this flight include things like manslaughter, rape, drug dealing, robbery? These are serious and persistent offenders.
I thank my honourable friend for his question. Yes, these are all people who are serious or persistent offenders, and offences on board include rape of minors, include people who've raped adults, include those who've been involved in serious drugs offences, and that is why we are required to issue a deportation notice.
Cecil Lohman.
And how many of the people scheduled to go on that flight have been assessed for their mental state? A number of them are vulnerable. On the back of what happened on the Windrush scandal, does he think it's fair to continue to treat people in this way?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Anyone entering immigration detention or entering detention is assessed as part of our adults at risk policy where there is a concern. But I would be clear, these are people who've been through the criminal justice process, some on a number of occasions, have completed sentences and are now liable to deportation under the law. And as we'd say, these are people who are being judged on their criminality, not their nationality, but they're subject to the exemptions that provided for in the 2007 Act.
Is that me? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Parliament in 2007 passed legislation to require the government to deport those who were guilty of serious or persistent offences. In those circumstances, were the government not to do it, does my honourable friend agree with me that the government itself would be liable to a judicial review?
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an interesting point my learned friend raises as to what would be the position. As he says, we are under a legal duty to make the deportation order based on the criminality, not the nationality. And that means that we would potentially have to answer to future victims if we adopted the policy opposite that, as I say, has been advocated now but wasn't supported by some of the members opposite when they were in government.
Lillian Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my right honourable friend, the member for Tottenham, has already noted, British citizens have, in the Windrush scandal, been wrongly deported. Why will the Minister not consider the possibility that these deportations should be suspended until the lessons learned review has been received and considered?
Minister.
Well, again, what I would say is we have considered whether of them would benefit from the protections under the Windrush scheme already. The answer is no. None of them are British citizens or nationals. And ultimately, this is a legal duty to remove serious or persistent criminal offenders, some people who have committed some absolutely appalling crimes in this country. I recognise the legal duty this government is under, the Home Secretary recognised the legal duty this government is under, and we will follow it.
You can't.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for confirming that all those set to be deported are not British nationals. And does he agree that it is right that we can deprive foreign offenders of British citizenship when they harm and endanger our communities? And drugs, Mr. Speaker, are not some unconscionable crime. They are serious. Look at the Scourge County lines. Now, can he confirm the majority of foreign offenders are in fact deported to the EU?
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It does have to be said that the majority of deportations are, I believe, to the EEA. And as I touched on in my initial answer, we deport criminals who meet these thresholds every week to a range of countries. And as we keep on saying, I'll say it again, it's the criminality, not the nationality, that determines the outcome in each case.
Abena Pongasari.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the individuals facing deportation tomorrow came to the UK aged 5. He committed a crime aged 17 and did the time many, many years ago. Is it fair to punish people for mistakes they have already paid for?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, when Parliament passed the 2007 Borders Act and the proposal of the government then, it would have considered whether it's appropriate to apply deportation orders to those who are serious or persistent offenders as part of the penalty for the crime. And if I believe the vast majority of the public think that's right, yes.
Scott Benson.
Does my honourable friend agree with me that attempts to play party political games with the Windrush scandal are absolutely shameful, especially given the fact that the National Audit Office report recognised that a hostile environment dated back to 2004 under the previous Labour government?
Minister.
Well, what I think is extraordinary today is to see people wanting to conflate a group of foreign national offenders who've been sentenced to a total of 300 years imprisonment with a generation that made such a huge contribution to this country. But the Home Office will be guided by the law, not party political points.
Nadia Whittam.
Does the Minister agree that if the lessons learned review that was leaked is correct, that in deporting 50 people tomorrow, the government would be going against its own recommendations in its own report, which has reportedly stated that those who have lived in the UK since children should not be deported?
Minister.
No.
Brendan Clark-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister agree with me that the opposition should be focusing on the appalling criminal behaviour of these perpetrators and not the government for simply implementing the law?
Minister.
Well, thank my honourable friend for that point. I think there'll be many people across many constituencies in this country who will be stunned to see the attitude some of the Labour Party are taking today.
Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister confirm that 50 people are booked on the flight to Jamaica tomorrow? And will he tell us of those, how many have been in the UK since childhood?
Minister.
I won't get into individual cases or numbers, but what I'm clear is all on due for deportation meet the legal threshold supported by this House in 2007.
But Everett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think we need to clarify here, Mr. Speaker, that
We're in a situation where the opposition benches are seemingly campaigning against Labour policy. So could I ask my right honourable friend, does he agree that foreign nationals who have committed crimes, serious crimes, in Britain should be under no doubt of our intention to deport them?
Absolutely. Those committing criminal offences in this country should be in no doubt that myself and the Home Secretary will ensure they face the penalties prescribed by law and they'll be judged on their criminality, not their nationality.
Alison Foulis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As the chair of the EPPG in immigration detention, I'm deeply concerned by some of the implications of this flight. And could I ask, because he didn't answer the question of the honourable member, the chair of the Select Committee, is he aware of the outages of phone signal at Harmsworth and Colnbrook immigration removal centres exposed by detention action? And have all of those on this flight had access to functioning mobile phones so that they might access legal representation?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As we said, one on this flight was doing a TV interview this morning. So there is privacy for communications provided. And again, we've met the legal thresholds, we met the legal test, and ultimately this is about, do we wish to deport serious or persistent offenders who have committed a range of offences? And I think many people will be watching with absolute astonishment at the attitude on the benches opposite.
Claudia Webb.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can the Minister tell us if any of the people scheduled for deportation tomorrow have had access to legal advice and representation?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As touched on, they've all been through the criminal justice system. Many have had quite extensive legal positions afterwards. They've been assessed on everything else. And I would say, yet again, we are complying with the law set in 2007. And the honourable member can shake her head, but it's the law her Labour predecessors voted for.
Catherine West.
Speaker, what reassurance can the Minister give that those who needed legal aid had access to legal aid in the background of cuts to legal aid over the last 10 years?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Again, it depends. During the criminal process and others, there would have been opportunities to access legal aid. But again, I would say we've met our legal duties, we've met the appropriate assessment around whether any of them meet any of the exemptions, and ultimately they are serious or persistent criminal offenders who present in some cases, an ongoing threat to people in this country. And we will put our legal duties first, and we will protect the public despite the calls from the Labour Party.
Siobhana Mahmood.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. May I say I deeply regret the willfully obtuse attitude taken by the Minister and the government benches regarding this issue. The Minister should not hide behind the 2007 law on deportation when he knows full well that the reason for our concerns relate to our expectation that the independent review will say, when it is published, that those who came to this country as children should not be deported. And this flight should not go ahead before that review is officially published and its recommendations published in full. Surely he can see that that is the only way we will know that we have not deported our own citizens.
Oh, thank you, Mr Speaker. Again, I'll repeat, there is no British citizen on that flight, and the Windrush potential eligibility for Windrush protections has been checked. And, as a minister, I remember not that many months ago we were getting lectures from the benches office on following the law and the rule of law. Now we're getting arguments that we should not. And it's not hiding behind the 2007 law. It's our duty to implement the 2007 law. And it's really quite extraordinary to see the reactions opposite from the party that brought it in.
Kate Green.
The Minister describe exactly to the House how the Government has carried out its duty under Section 55 of the Borders and Immigration Act 2009 to ensure that any child affected by an immigration decision has their welfare properly considered. Does he know how many of those who are leaving the country on this flight have the care of or responsibility for or close family relationships with children in Britain?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Where matters have been raised around family or around dependent children, those have been professionally assessed before the decision taken to put on a deportation flight. And again, of course, the nature of the criminality and the offences of some of those involved will, of course, be taken into account when that is done.
Stephen Doherty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The problem with all of these answers from the Minister is that he's asking us to trust a department and a system that's been found of repeated and costly failures. He admitted to me himself in a written question just a couple of weeks ago that the Home Office had wrongly detained 312 people at a cost of £8.2 million compensation in just 1 year, 2018-19. That was up from 212 cases costing £5 million in 2017-18. And he yet refuses to give us the statistics on wrongful deportations and the costs associated with them. When will he come clear about how much money the department has paid out for wrongfully deporting people, including, as they've done in the past, one of my own constituents?
Minister.
Well, let me be clear about the facts on tomorrow's flight. A total of about 300 years of sentences of imprisonment for those on board. The natures of the offences committed and the bill that's there and the legal duty that's present. And I'll say this government will follow the law, and I'll say our system's based on criminality, not nationality. And ultimately, if we're the real failure, would be if we left the public to face the consequences of us not removing subsistent and serious criminals.
We now come to a ministerial statement.